listening to 106.7, Wilmington's Big Talker, and my name is Paul Vallone. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Sunday at 5 p.m., as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. In case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground, the expansion of concealed carry into state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of people from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. First of all, this week's Weinstein moment is brought to you by Harvey Weinstein, the gift that keeps on giving. As you undoubtedly know, long-suppressed accusations of sexual harassment against Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein have led scores of women to come forward and identify all sorts of sexual harassers among the leftists of not only Hollywood, but also the media and now even Congress. Regular listeners know that I love the word Schadenfreude. This delicious German expression is for taking joy in the misfortune of others, particularly one's opponents, in this case, one's political opponents. So please humor me as I rejoice in the most recent leftist implosions, especially anti-gun liberal representative John Conyers, Democrat of Michigan, who has spent nearly 5 decades doing his best to gut the Second Amendment, and who now faces multiple accusations of sexual harassment. As it comes to light, not only has Conyers been sexually harassing women for decades, but he has apparently used taxpayer money to cover it all up. Especially joyous has been watching Madam Moonbat, also known as Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, a leader in the Party of Women, mind you, defending Conyers to NBC's Meet the Press, saying, and I quote, "John Conyers is an icon to our country. He has done a great deal to protect women." I guess that means aside from showing up for staff meetings in his skivvies. Of course, Pelosi has now done an about-face, calling for Conyers' resignation, and that, of course, is all you're going to hear from the media. Speaking of NBC, however, that bastion of progressivism and the parent company of the truly wacky leftists of MSNBC, let me utter 2 words: Matt Lauer. 8. Count them, 8 women. Then we have the latest trials and tribulations of Senator Fishlips, Al Franken, with additional complaints coming forward against the senator from one model, including one model, whom I guess he subjected to a slimy French kiss, who dubbed him Fishlips. For those of you out there who are capable of making bumper stickers, remember, I'm still waiting for somebody to mail me the bumper sticker that says, Senator Fishlips must go. Now in gun rights news, yet another mass murder was stopped, in this case prevented, not by 1 but 2 lawful concealed handgun permit holders who happily shot the perpetrator. This comes from Ammoland.com. It was posted by Dean Weingarten under the title, "In Florida, Yet Another Mass Murder Stopped by Armed Citizens." To quote the piece, and I quote, "In the parking lot of Schlenker Automotive in Rockledge, Florida, at 4:30 p.m. on the 25th of November, 2 armed citizens stopped a mass murder in progress. Police Chief Joseph P. Lasata of the Rockledge Police Department made clear the intervention of the armed citizens was responsible for stopping the murderer. 2 employees were shot, 1 killed in a parking lot, after which 2 armed employees intervened. According to WESH, Police Chief Lasata said, and I quote, "The perpetrator had multiple magazines on his person. He was intent on doing harm. The employees stepped up and prevented customers, employees, and other vendors who were in the business at the time from sustaining further injuries. They did a good job." The murder suspect, Robert Lorenzo Bailey, Jr., 28, of Cocoa, is in critical condition at Holmes Regional Medical Center in Melbourne. His history has not been released, and the suspect is not connected to Schlenker Automotive. The murder and gunfight started in Schlenker's parking lot. The suspect opened fire on a 25-year-old employee, paralyzing him. He shot and killed 50-year-old Roger Lee Smith, who had been employed at the shop for numerous years, as Smith came out the door to the parking lot. The 2 armed employees who had concealed carry permits intervened. This is what FloridaToday.com had to say about the incident. And I quote, "The gunman killed 1 employee and paralyzed a second. That's when the employees at Schlenker Automotive fought back with equal force." Rockledge Police Chief Joseph Lasata said, quote, "The manager, who was a concealed handgun permit holder, came out and engaged in gunfire in the parking lot." Lasata said, "The manager fled back into the building, being chased by the gunman. Another Schlenker employee, who also had a concealed weapons permit, engaged in gunfire with the suspect." This is the second time in 3 weeks that armed citizens have intervened in mass murder, preventing further murders from taking place. The first, of course, was Stephen Williford, an NRA instructor who grabbed his AR-15 and engaged the mass murderer at the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas, on November 5th. By the way, I should note here that AmmoLand.com is an excellent gun-related news clipping source. I heartily recommend that you subscribe. Now, in a moment, we're going to discuss the United States Supreme Court and its, recent refusal to take not 1 but 2 Second Amendment cases, letting stand some egregious decisions from the lower Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. This, of course, on the heels, just weeks ago, of the District of Columbia deciding not to appeal its loss in Wren versus D.C. and striking down its draconian restrictions on handguns. But unfortunately, this would have been a case that could have been precedent-setting law on bearing arms outside the home, a matter which so far still remains unsettled after numerous previous cases, including one here in North Carolina on the topic, failed to draw Supreme Court hearings. So, right now, we are going to take a short break, after which we will return with a discussion of those 2 Second Amendment cases, which unfortunately will not make it to the United States Supreme Court to become precedent-setting law. And by the way, what is it with the Supreme Court? Wasn't all of this supposed to improve after Trump nominated Neil Gorsuch? This was supposed to be our savior, and perhaps he is. Perhaps the problem is elsewhere. We will actually, next week, have a guest on to discuss all of the ramifications of recent legislation which will or will not set precedent, make precedent-setting law in the Supreme Court, when we have Dave Coppell of the Independence Institute come discuss these cases. Meanwhile, you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker. I am Paul Vallone. This is 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Please join us after the break as we continue to discuss which court cases will or will not become precedent-setting law for the Second Amendment. My name is Paul Vallone, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7 WilmingtonBigTalker.com. As we mentioned before our break, you might not know it, but the United States Supreme Court just refused not one but two Second Amendment cases, letting stand egregious decisions from the lower Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. This on the heels just weeks ago of the District of Columbia deciding not to appeal its loss in Wren versus D.C., which would have, or actually did, strike down its draconian restrictions on concealed carry in the District of Columbia. Now, this was a case that could have become precedent-setting law for bearing arms outside the home. And that matter, as a matter of fact, remains unsettled after numerous previous cases on the topic failed to draw Supreme Court hearings, including one case here in North Carolina, Bateman versus Purdue, in which the Second Amendment Foundation, my organization, Grassroots North Carolina, and some individual plaintiffs sued then-Governor Beverly Perdue over our state of emergency gun ban, which at that point in time entirely prohibited carrying firearms outside the home during declared states of emergency, which ironically is just when you need them most, when you've got looting going on and that sort of thing. So the good news is we won that case in federal court. The bad news is the state chose not to appeal its loss. And so what we had hoped would go to the Supreme Court as precedent-setting law for bearing arms outside the home never did so. The only good news there being that we went back and actually repealed the state's now unconstitutional state of emergency gun ban. So, I'm happy to say that on next week's show, we will have as our guest nationally renowned gun rights attorney David Kopel of the Independence Institute to discuss the full implications of the latest developments and other developments, of course, in the ongoing effort to lead the Supreme Court to fully recognize the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. The problem here is that although we have the Heller decision and the McDonald decision on record, which established a right to keep arms in the home, but not necessarily a right to bear arms outside the home. This week, however, I would like to give it to you from an activist's perspective, specifically that of my good friend Jeff Knox of the Firearms Coalition. Jeff's father, Neil Knox, was largely responsible for making the NRA into the legislative juggernaut it is today. Neil founded the Firearms Coalition, a loose-knit coalition of organizations and activists defending the Second Amendment, which Jeff continues to direct. Jeff writes for a variety of publications, including Firearms News and AmmoLand.com. And Jeff's piece in AmmoLand.com discussing the Supreme Court refusal to take recent cases is entitled, and Jeff didn't pull any punches here, I'm quoting this, Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals makes Supreme Court their bitch over guns. Jeff writes, and I quote, on November 27, 2017, the Supreme Court of the United States once again refused to stand up to protect the Second Amendment by turning down 2 cases challenging infringing state gun laws, both of which had been wrongly decided in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. One was a Florida case where the state courts have, on the one hand, declared that there is a state constitutional right to bear arms for self-defense outside the home, but on the other hand have declared that carrying concealed is a privilege, not a right. That means that the right may only be exercised if you have been granted the privilege of doing so by the state. Interesting. So Floridians have a right to carry firearms for personal defense. They just can't exercise that right unless they jump through hoops, pay a fee, and are granted the privilege to carry concealed by the state. The specific case, which is Norman versus Florida, is particularly troubling because Mr. Norman jumped through the hoops, paid the fee, and was granted the privilege to exercise his right. Unfortunately, the first time he exercised that privilege, he failed to conceal the firearm to the satisfaction of local police, who swarmed him and put him face down on the sidewalk in handcuffs. He was subsequently found guilty of openly carrying a firearm and fined $300 plus court costs. Jeff writes, it's difficult to avoid speculation that had Mr. Norman been white and wearing Dockers and a polo, the stop and the results might have been significantly different than they were. A polite conversation with a stern warning about not allowing the gun to be easily observed would likely have been as far as things would have gone. But Mr. Norman is not a white man, and he wasn't dressed in business casual that day. He's a black man and was peacefully going about his business in a tank top and cargo shorts. By refusing to hear the case, the Supreme Court allows the decision of the Circuit Court to stand, leaving the right to carry in Florida subject to gaining the privilege to do so from the state and requiring that the exercise of that right be in accordance with the terms of the privilege, namely concealed only. As troubling as that case is, the other case turned away by SCOTUS, meaning the Supreme Court of the United States, is even more troubling. The case of Colby versus Hogan was a challenge to Maryland's draconian ban on so-called assault weapons and so-called high-capacity magazines. In this case, while the Fourth Circuit deciding that the ban is not constitutional is a serious concern, the Circuit Court's rationale for that decision is an even bigger problem. Says Jeff, I wrote about this case earlier this year and was convinced that SCOTUS would have no choice but to address the Circuit's decision because it took the SCOTUS decision in Heller and stood it on its head. The judges of the Fourth Circuit actually claimed that the Supreme Court ruled in Heller that guns like the AR-15 are not protected by the Second Amendment because they are of a type that would be particularly useful in a military application. And I should note that's entirely backwards from the 1939 U.S. versus Miller case. Anyways, to reach this conclusion, the Fourth Circuit judges took a minor comment from Justice Scalia's decision in Heller and completely changed the very obvious meaning and intent of the comment and the Heller decision itself. This is very similar to what happened in the Miller case, leading to decades of misinterpretation of the Second Amendment and bad rulings. In reaching the Heller decision, it is clear that there are some on the court who are worried about the decision that the decision would open up the possibility of challenges to the National Firearms Act. That's the National Firearms Act of 1934, regulating machine guns, short-barreled rifles and shotguns, suppressors, and destructive devices. And the Hughes Amendment, which banned the sale of full-auto firearms manufactured after 1986. Justice Scalia provided some groundwork for defense of the NFA and Hughes by focusing on the idea that the protected arms of the Second Amendment are those that are in common use among the people at a given time. Scalia posited it may be objected that if weapons that are the most useful in military service, M16 rifles and the like, may be banned, then the Second Amendment right is completely detached from the prefatory clause. He was suggesting that the argument should boil down to the issue of whether the particular arms in question are of a type that is of common use, currently in common use. The idea being that since full auto military arms like the M16 are not in common use among the people, they are not protected by the Second Amendment. We're going to take a short break. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. We will return in a moment with our discussion of the Supreme Court and its decisions. My name is Paul Vallone, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Before the break, we were discussing the Supreme Court's unfortunate refusal to take up two cases wrongly decided by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which, by the way, includes North Carolina, meaning that its poor decisions are binding on us until overturned by the Supreme Court. At issue in particular is the case Colby versus Hogan, which deals with Maryland's so-called assault weapons ban. The Fourth Circuit wrongly interpreted a remark made by former Justice Antonin Scalia in the D.C. versus Heller decision, where he had reasoned that full auto firearms might not be protected by the Second Amendment. However, Scalia's opinion on the issue was not part of the official decision rendered by the court in D.C. versus Heller, rendering it non-binding. Nevertheless, the Fourth Circuit ruled that because the semi-automatic rifles banned in Maryland are superficially similar to those described by Justice Scalia, and despite the fact that Scalia's comments were not part of the official decision, that therefore semi-automatic rifles, often called modern utility rifles, are not protected by the Second Amendment. Says Jeff Knox of the Firearms Coalition, who again was writing in Ammoland.com, and I quote, "That is clearly not at all what Scalia was suggesting. Usually, the Supreme Court is very protective of their past decisions, and they are quick to slap down a lower court that tries to distort and abuse them, especially in a landmark case like Heller. So for the court to let stand such a flagrant assault on a recent decision is just astonishing. We've been saying for a long time that the Second Amendment will not be safe until at least one, but preferably two more solid pro-Constitution justices are appointed to the court. The loss of Justice Scalia was a serious blow, but even before that, the Second Amendment wasn't safe and there was little chance of seeing our rights advance. Justice Kennedy has hinted that he might retire next year, and expectations of Justice Ginsburg's long-awaited departure have begun to feel like a bad Saturday Night Live sketch. Doesn't it look like she's sort of the Walking Dead? But anyways. But Justice Thomas isn't getting any younger or fitter either, and bad precedents are piling up in the lower courts. Replacing Ginsburg and Kennedy, while Thomas is still on the court, could pull us back from the brink. But it's all just guessing and wishful thinking at this point. One thing is certain. Justice Ginsburg would keep serving after her death to avoid having Donald Trump name her replacement. Maybe she already is. I'm not sure about that. If Democrats gain control of the Senate, all of this would be moot, though, because Schumer and the Democrats will block any and all Trump appointments to the court, even if he's reelected for another 4 years. So, Jeff summarizes by saying the strongest argument for a Trump presidency was, and by my words here, continues to be, the judges he would appoint to the court. As I noted earlier, next week we will hear the opinion of nationally renowned Second Amendment attorney Dave Kopel of the Independence Institute on the issues such as Colby and also the Wren decision and what it means to the concealed handgun ban, to the fact that the concealed handgun ban was not appealed by the District of Columbia, which lost the case in the Fourth Circuit. Now we have some good news and some not so good news. As you know, our own Congressman, Richard Hudson of Concord, introduced H.R. 38, the Concealed Handgun Reciprocity Act of 2017. Sponsored by a grand total of 213 Republicans, the bill would establish a national requirement for states to honor each other's concealed handgun permits. Better yet, it corrects flaws in legislation introduced in previous sessions of Congress by extending reciprocity even to residents of states in which no permit is required to carry concealed firearms for lawful purposes, places like, for example, Vermont, Arizona, and some others, Alaska. I believe there are at this point 11 constitutional carry states. And despite my concerns that the bill might be rendered unacceptable by trying to capture restrictive states such as California, New York, and New Jersey, the bill this week passed the House Judiciary Committee in a 19-11 party line vote after having fended off all Democrat anti-gun amendments. And as the final bit of good news, the bill will likely fast-track it to the House floor for a vote, possibly as early as this coming week. Now, for the less good news. You probably know that the killer in the Sutherland Springs church shootings passed a federal background check via the National Instant Background Check System, or NICS, because the Air Force had failed to report his disqualifying crimes to the FBI. Enter Senators John Cornyn, Republican of Texas, and, of course, perennial anti-gunner Chris Murphy, Democrat of Connecticut, with Senate Bill 2035, the so-called Fix NICS Act of 2017. The bill, ostensibly modest in scope, denies federal funding to states and agencies which fail to adequately report disqualifying crimes to the FBI for inclusion in the database. That, of course, all sounds fine in theory. However, in practice, this is the same sort of improvement of the NICS system which in 2007 caused 260,000 veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder to lose their gun rights. And I'm sorry, that was 2011, not 2007. So please pardon me if I express skepticism over this lovely bipartisan measure. In any case, the same day the House Judiciary Committee passed national reciprocity, they also quietly slipped through a version of the Fix NICS bill, presumably in a deal brokered by the NRA. And I'm an NRA life member, but I hate to tell you, they have a long history of brokering bad deals like this one. In North Carolina, for example, in the early 2000s, they were so interested in passing a bill to prohibit cities from suing gun manufacturers, that they allowed to be added to their bill an entire gun show bill that frankly would have shut down most of the gun shows in the state, and then proceeded to tell their members that these two bills were not actually part of the same legislation. We continued pointing out that in fact they were, and that they were misleading their own members. Hopefully this will not be a subterfuge of that magnitude. So, the Senate Judiciary Committee is now calendared to take up its version of the Fix NICS bill as early as Wednesday. And in fact, I was talking to my good friend Dr. John Lott of the Crime Prevention Research Center about that the other day, and he may have some ideas to improve the bill. Hopefully that he can provide some measure for reducing false positives on NICS background checks. So far, there is no national reciprocity bill in the Senate, and although a reciprocity bill could be added in conference committee, which resolves the differences in the House and Senate versions of the bills, Republicans would still lack the needed votes to override the inevitable filibuster by anti-gun Democrats. The bottom line is, don't hold your breath on this one, folks. And of course, the McClatchy newspaper organs in North Carolina, the Raleigh News and Observer, and the Charlotte Observer, immediately quoted members of Michael Bloomberg's AstroTurf organization, Moms Demand Action, saying, and I quote, "Because the bill does not create a national standard, it is dangerous for our communities and really makes it difficult to know if someone who is carrying a gun has been trained and has had a background check versus someone who has not." What they fail to mention, of course, is that because North Carolina has honored all out-of-state concealed handgun permits since 2011, virtually everybody who will be able to carry in North Carolina under Hudson's bill can already do so. On that note, folks, we're going to take a short break. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom. We'll come on back and we'll talk about gun control and, more importantly, how they want to control it. My name is Paul Vallone, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. In continuing our discussion of legislation for national concealed handgun reciprocity, which, as we noted, is likely to reach the U.S. House floor as early as this coming week, I have more good news and bad news. The good news, as reported by the NRA, is that 24 attorneys general from across the country signed a letter spearheaded by Missouri Attorney General Josh Hawley supporting H.R. 38, the National Concealed Handgun Reciprocity Act. The bad news is that, predictably, North Carolina's Attorney General Josh Stein is not among them. In fact, our anti-gun Attorney General, who garnered a 0-star evaluation in Grassroots North Carolina's Remember in November candidate evaluation project, signed a different letter, along with 16 other Democrat attorneys general, against the bill, saying it would, and I quote, lead to the death of police officers and civilians, the proliferation of gun traffickers, and acts of terrorism and other mass violence. Wow, I never knew we concealed handgun permit holders were such a notorious lot. Never mind that over the past 30 years, shall issue concealed handgun laws in which applicants with clean backgrounds and training cannot be refused permits have expanded from a handful of states to nearly the entire country. All 50 states now have some provision for concealed carry, without any of the Wild West mayhem predicted by gun ban advocates. Never mind that controlled multivariate research from Dr. John Lott of the Crime Prevention Research Center and others have determined that shall-issue concealed handgun laws deter murder, rape, and aggravated assault. And never mind that with, I believe, 2 exceptions, all of the mass killings in the United States since 1950 have occurred in so-called gun-free zones, which should be more properly called victim disarmament zones. Nah, to the leftists like Attorney General Josh Stein, none of this makes a difference. Why? Because your safety and the safety of your family is irrelevant to Stein. What he cares about is that laws like the Concealed Handgun Reciprocity Act make you just a tiny bit more independent and less reliant on government to, and I use this word in quotes, protect you. Stein doesn't like that very much because Stein and his ilk want you to be good little serfs. Elsewhere, the Washington Post, in its typical fashion, is now telling church parishioners how to protect themselves from mass killings. After all, aren't the lefties of the Post the preeminent experts on how to protect yourself from criminal predation? Yes, sirree, you should check it out. The article is entitled, "Smack Them with a Hymnal. Authorities Train Church Leaders to Respond if Tragedy Strikes." Yes, you heard that correctly. If a mass killer darkens your church door, spraying death upon the congregation, you are supposed to, and I quote, smack them with a hymnal. You see, the Post was kind enough to relay some of the suggestions for church safety being promoted by a sheriff in Westminster, Maryland. Among his suggestions are organize a volunteer security team among parishioners. Okay, reasonable. Install a security camera system. Yeah, okay. Give ushers radios and have them serve as watchdogs outside the church before services start. That may make them the active shooter's first victims. Let's see. Make sure cell phones work in the basements. Limit access for entry and exiting a place of worship so officials can have a better sense of who's coming and going. Give local law enforcement agencies a copy of your building's layout so they know the entrances and how to find people in cases of emergency. I guess this so the responding officers will trip over fewer bodies when they arrive 5 minutes after the shooting began. If they need to find people in case of an emergency, in this case, they will probably be the ones lying on the floor. Check that the sanctuary doors can be locked from inside to keep a gunman out. Know your congregation, because everybody has a breaking point, as they say. If somebody says they're having an emotional, mental, or financial problem, talk to that person. The chances of someone breaking among your members is more likely than a random shooter. You see, after all, in the eyes of the left, killers are not the people with long histories of violence. Oh no. But rather you and me, since obviously none of us can be trusted. Let's see, the next one is greet everyone who comes into a church. So just saying, hi, how are you, may help diffuse their temper for a moment. Yes, sir, I'm sure a howdy is going to be enough to deter a violent sociopath. And finally, we have the preferred option of disarmed victims everywhere, which has worked so wonderfully in the gun-free zones mass killers have used to multiply their carnage. Here it is. If there is a gunman in church, go low to the ground to get away from bullets. And look for heavy items to use as barricades, such as pews or podiums. There we have it. You know, I'm pretty sure there's an option they missed, but I'll be damned if I can put my finger on it. Let me think. Was it? No. Oh, wait. I remember. Shoot the bastard. God bless the pastors of the River at Tampa Bay Church who placed a large and red and black signs at the entrances saying, and I quote, "Welcome to the River at Tampa Bay Church. Right of admission reserved. This is private property. Please know this is not a gun-free zone. We are heavily armed. Any attempt will be met with deadly force. Yes, we are a church and will protect our people. Signed, the pastors. Associate Pastor Alan Hayes told Fox 13 Tampa the sign had actually been up for more than a year, but garnered attention after one of the other pastors posted it on his Instagram account. It has apparently drawn the usual and predictable fire on social media from the usual statists, but Reverend Hawes responded quite succinctly, and I quote, "Would I rather ruffle a few feathers, or do I want to count bodies?" So let's celebrate this church as the last place on earth a violent sociopath will pick for his mayhem. Let's celebrate this church for its frank understanding of human behavior, and let's celebrate this church for understanding that the Lord helps those who help themselves. Nor, fortunately, is the River at Tampa Bay Church alone in taking responsibility for its security. According to the New York Daily News, after Sutherland Springs, Pastor Jamie Chapa of El Faro Bible Church in Sullivan City, Texas, told station KRGV that he too will be carrying a handgun during church services, and he expects all of his licensed parishioners to be carrying weapons in the house of worship as well. He says, what happened in Sutherland Springs will not ever happen in our church. And according to the Salt Lake Tribune, Chuck Hike of SOG, Special Operations Group Soldiers of God, a nonprofit minister, will teach ministers and clergy how to handle active threat scenarios. This is in Utah, and he says, Jesus says, I did not bring peace but a sword. In order to have peace, we have to kill the evil. What about your church? I've received any number of inquiries from people concerned about their church policies on concealed carry and carrying firearms in the Congregation for Self-Protection. I would suggest that you have this discussion with your pastor and church elders and encourage them to adopt a rational policy. In closing today's show, you've all doubtless heard about the travesty of justice in California as a San Francisco jury refused to convict Jose Garcia Zarate for the murder of Kate Steinle. What you may not have heard is the words of Matt Gonzalez, Zarate's attorney, about who's really responsible for the death of Kate Steinle. Here's what he told Fox News the other day, and I quote, Kate's family should not interpret this verdict as diminishing their loss. It's not about that. The reality is that we have 300 million guns in our society, 40 or 50 accidental shootings every day. Somebody dies after every day, and this is just another tragedy, what happened. Translated, Steinle's death is not the fault of illegal immigrant activity or one repeatedly coming into the country in violation of law. It's not about our open borders policy or about the left's determination to make the United States just another third world country. Nope. According to Zarate's lawyer, Kate Steinle died because of you, because you defend your right to keep and bear arms. It's your fault. My name is Paul Vallone. You've been listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com, where each Sunday at 5 p.m. as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to defend your gun rights. Please join us next week as we bring attorney David Kopel of the Independence Institute. Also, you can find my writings and works at gunspoliticsandfreedom.com. See you next Sunday at 5.